Uh, Hi everyone. Welcome back. You're still here. That means I haven't scared you off. Right? Uh, so today we are gonna try to cover a lot of stuff again as last time. Uh, and again, the idea even for today is just to give you an intuitive understanding of different things rather than go into depth. So it will be more of an exposition rather than teaching you the nitty-gritties, right? So last time what we did was we covered the basics and we went through a lot of different architectures and loss functions, and at the end we talk about attention mechanisms, right? So you got a pretty good understanding of how the field developed these segmentation architectures. And then in the last 10 minutes, I spoke about invariance and equivariance and why do we need deep learning architectures to have those two properties. And we saw that data augmentation is one of the ways that you can impose those two properties, right? So today, I'll continue with that. I'll briefly talk about what representation learning, self-supervised learning means, and how these things can improve the accuracy of your model and help you in generalization experiments to other settings. Then we'll completely switch gears and talk about a little bit of generative modeling. Paul will go into much more detail about GANs. So I'll talk about how GANs are used in something called domain adaptation and generalization. That should pretty much take 1 full hour. And then finally, I'll start talking about shape priors and how can you impose topology constraints and make the network architectures have some sense of geometry of your anatomy. Right? So that's the plan for today. Again, it's going to be a lot of papers. We won't cover all the papers. Many of the slides will be there for you to look at your free time, just so you get an idea. And yeah. Okay, so we'll talk about transfer learning first. So just recall that we talked about these two things, invariance and equivariance, and why we need these two properties so that our model is able to better generalize to unseen settings, right? And again, just to recall once more, data augmentation was one way to do it, right? And then I briefly mentioned that there is a whole field called group equivalent networks, which deals with these kind of problems, right? So another way of looking at trying to improve the accuracy of your model or to get a good representation in your weights and biases of your model is something called transfer learning, right? I'm pretty much sure that you might have heard this word somewhere, right? So anyone wants to tell me what transfer learning means in one sentence? Yeah.
After the training, model will have the training characters like weight and biases there. Can you use this network to think of the data set from literally and the software of the your data set will similar or have some same things to your approach the data set. So before you did you kind of two those weight and bias so those net and take those much bigger and easier than you
Yeah, that's perfect. Perfect definition of transfer learning. So that's what we are going to do next. Try to train a model which is dependent on some other task to be able to generalize it better to some other task, right? So we'll talk about self-supervision first. But again, just to recall what transfer learning is, basically think of you have a classification task in medical imaging, but you are limited by the number of training examples you have, right? So what you generally do is you go to the computer vision field, take a ResNet architecture, which is used for classification, which has been trained on millions and millions of natural images. You take that particular architecture, you freeze the weights and biases in the lower levels of the architecture. And then with the new data set, you just retrain the upper level or the upper layers of your architecture so that the model is now, you're not training the model from scratch. You're just starting from a trained model. You're just fine tuning it with your new data set for which you don't have many training examples, right? So that's what most of the field does, right? You don't start training your models from scratch. You do it from something which is already trained, right? And in medical imaging, since we do it in 3D images, you can, if you have a segmentation task for, let's say, lungs, you can, or like some part in the abdomen, you can start using a segmentation network which was already trained on some other part of the abdomen and then reuse the network instead of training it from scratch. So how do we go about it, right? What are some of the ways to do it? So there is something called self-supervised learning, right? So essentially the idea of transfer learning is that you start with a good representation of the model already, right? So how do we get a good representation of a trained model? So here's where self-supervised learning methods come into picture. So imagine you, if you look on the left, uh, as we talked about in lecture number 1, we have this brain imaging of 3D brains of, let's say, T1 weighted images, and you want to parcellate the whole brain into 95 regions, right? But again, instead of training it from scratch, training a segmentation model from scratch, you can actually first train the model for some other task, right? And then with the trained model and with this label data set, you retrain the model for a few layers for n number of iterations to get a better accuracy, right? Or better performance of the model. And note that in this case, you're starting from an already good representation of the trained architecture. So if you want to train a network to parcellate the brain into n number of regions, what you can do is you have your own segmentation architecture, and you just use some unlabeled data. Just take the MRI images instead of the segmentations. Just take the MRI images and you just rotate your images by 90 degrees, 45 degrees, whatever, right? And you create this new data set where you have your original MRI image, which is at its original position. So let's call it 0-degree rotated. Then you have a copy of the same image at 45-degree rotation. Then you rotate that even further and you have it, let's say, at 135 degrees or 90 degrees, right? So you get this new training data set where your input is MRI image or rotated copies of the MRI image, and your label is what is the degree of rotation, right? Whether it is 0, 45, and so on. So your task, your self-supervised task over here is that you take your segmentation architecture, which you want to train, and you train it on this particular task. And the task is your input MRI image, and you're going to predict how much that particular image is rotated by, right? So you create this dummy task on your own, right? Where you are still inputting MRI images, but your output is just the prediction of what is the rotation, right? So this way you train the network on this particular task, right? And then when your actual segmentation tasks come into the picture, you keep this trained network, right? Now you bring in your original MRI images and you bring in your labels, those 95 brain regions, and you retrain this network only for the upper layers, right? So in this way, you can create auxiliary tasks for yourself and come up with better accuracy. Does that make sense? How do we just make random auxiliary tasks and then have that as a starting point, right? Because of the first task, this auxiliary task of prediction of the rotations, what you're doing essentially is you're starting with a good representation for your actual segmentation task, right? And yeah. Yeah, so on the right, this is another auxiliary task where I take my input MRI image, jumble it up, right? Like make a jigsaw out of it. And my auxiliary task here is to reconstruct the image back to its original, like solve this jigsaw puzzle, right? Yeah, that's a very good question. I think people might have done it in their papers to show, but I don't know. Definitely it will affect. I don't know what empirical studies people have performed on that. But yeah. Yeah, so another example is you jumble your image and you try to predict the actual image, right? So yeah, an advantage of this particular task is that the network architecture remains the same because you're using that encoder decoder kind of output, right? And then there is also, you can also predict, like take your input 3D image, flatten this into different patches, and then you can predict, let's say, which patch comes before and which patch comes after. Like you can create whatever task you want, which reasonably makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, as I was saying, this rotation prediction task, right? Or in over here, it was basically prediction of which patch comes before and which patch comes top of the current patch, stuff like that. There is also something called contrast type networks, which can take care of these things. But just wanted to show you that there is a field called contrastive learning. There are methods based on something called contrastive learning, which you can look it up, and that way also you can create these tasks, right? Any questions so far? Right. So that was like 2 slides overview of what representation learning means, basically coming up with good representation for your networks and then use it in a transfer learning setting, right? So these kind of tasks are especially useful for the things that we are going to see next, especially for image to image translation. Most of the things that you might have seen in media right now, where they generate a lot of fake images, they generally start by they start from a trained model and then fine tune that, right? Okay, so we are gonna shift gears very from 1 to 5 now. So again, think of this as another topic and think of how this can be applied to your problems of image segmentation and image registration. So I'll start with describing these things, and then we'll see a couple of examples from our work in the lab and also other places in the literature. Okay. So let's define these 2 terms, domain adaptation and domain generalization. They're related terms, but they still have quite a lot of difference. Okay, so domain adaptation, right? So imagine you have a task where your task is to classify these objects in natural images, right? Horse, dog, house, guitar, what have you, right? That is a task, right? And your training set, it consists of images of these for this particular task, but it's coming from different domain, right? Every image is coming from different domain. So you can have natural photo looking objects, right? Then you can have images coming from an art painting. You can have images which look like cartoons. And then you can have images which look like sketches, right? And the task here is to predict horse in any of these domains, right? So what generally happens is that by now you should know that if you train a model on one particular set of domains, right? And then you test it directly on some other domain which your network has not seen at training time, it will fail to generalize, right? This you probably have seen both from your current assignment and also earlier lectures in the course that this is just this is called a domain shift or a covariate shift problem, right? Where it's hard to generalize your segmentation and registration methods from one domain to another, right? So for example, a method developed for CT images might not work for MRI images, or like a method coming from images trained on Siemens images might not work on images which were obtained from GE machine, right? So this is called domain adaptation, where we are trying to solve this problem of adapting from one domain from a set of domains to the domain at test time. Right? Another example is just this classification of digits where it is coming from different domains, right? Some are natural images, like here. Some are synthetic images. Some are RGB images. Some have grayscale values, right? And you want to make sure your model is able to generalize at test time. So again, in terms of medical imaging, you can see that, let's say I have a task here again of brain parcellation and white matter hyperintensity segmentation. You can see clearly that these 4 images, even though all of them are T1 weighted images, they still have significant distributions, right? Their distribution of intensity patterns is tremendously different from each other, right? So you want to make sure your model is able to generalize to images at test time, which it has not seen during training, or have seen much less than other examples in training. Again, example of colonoscopy here, a model which is trained on this particular lighting to detect these lesions might, if a model is just trained on this particular lighting, it might not generalize to images which have been at test time, which you'll get with this particular lighting, right? Right, and again, G, Philips, Siemens, we all know that this is a known problem, right? Right, so one of the earliest papers on this topic in deep learning was this something called unsupervised domain adaptation by backpropagation, or DANN, right? This was in 2014, 2015, and again, it was on this data set, right, where you have 3 domains at training time, and then at test time, you have the 4th domain. Right, so how do we go about doing? Okay, first of all, I'm just going to talk about this particular paper because this was one of the earliest papers, and I feel like if you can understand this, then it will be easier to develop on other methods. So again, our task over here is to classify images such as dogs and cats, right? And what do we want to achieve by domain adaptation? We want 2 things out of the network: that it should be discriminative enough for the main learning task on the source domain, right? That is, it should be able to detect a cat from a dog, right? Yet it should have features, it should learn features which are invariant across all the different 4 domains that I showed you, right? Source domains are basically which you are training on, and target domain is which you haven't seen, or which you have seen less of, right? 2 things to mention: domain adaptation can be both supervised and unsupervised, right? So we are going to look at unsupervised domain adaptation, right? Supervised is when your target domain, you have very little training set. So with source domains, you can have like thousands of training data, but with target domain, when it's supervised, you have, let's say, only 100 labeled examples, right? So it can be both unsupervised and supervised way. So for this particular network, what the authors did was they divided the network into 3 components. The first one was this feature extractor, where you have your input image X coming from any of the domains, and you extract some features F out of it, right? And then you have 2 legs after this particular encoder, where the first is it will classify your labels Y, whether it's a cat or a dog, or what have you. And the second layer, or the second leg, is basically domain classification, right? Whether it's coming from domain 1, domain 2, or domain 3, right? So these are simple 3 components. It's just multi-layer perceptron, simple convolution networks, nothing fancy. So this part is, it makes sense that you have your class labels, and it is just a vanilla CNN or vanilla MLP, which is classifying these labels. And this part is basically trying to distinguish where that particular image is coming from, domain 1, domain 2, or domain 3, right? But as I mentioned, we don't want that. We want to confuse the network, that we are not able to tell where the particular image is coming from. We want to learn invariant features, right? Because we want for the network to have an idea that it is learning features from across all domains, and not just being biased towards one particular domain, right? So we technically want the network to not be able to classify where this domain is coming from, right? And by doing that, we can say that the network is learning invariant features across all the source domains, right? Because if it is learning how to distinguish domain one, like a picture of a cat coming from natural images and picture of a cat coming from sketches, right? Then if it is able to distinguish these two domains, then basically it means that it is not learning invariant features. It still has a good idea of where these two domains are coming from, but what we want is to make the network learn features which are common to these two domains. What makes a cat cat rather than what makes a cat coming from sketches versus cat coming from natural images, right? So all they did to make this invariant is, while doing backpropagation, they just multiply the gradient at this level from the classifier layer to the feature layer. They just multiply it by a -1, right? So while doing backpropagation, while computing the gradients of this particular loss function with respect to the network parameters, somewhere here, they just multiply it by a negative quantity. And so by doing so, what they're doing is they are trying to maximize the loss, right? Or in other words, they are, instead of going in a negative gradient direction, now they're going in a positive gradient direction, right? So they're trying to confuse the network. So it's a very simple idea of just like literally multiplying it by minus lambda, and it works really nice. Right? But you get the intuitive understanding of why do we want the network to learn invariant features and how it is being done, right? Any questions? Yeah, so this leg, again, it is still able to classify it's coming from, it's a cat or a dog, and this, it's getting fooled to learn that sketches and pictures have same representation of cats. Yeah, so that is basically domain adaptation, trying to learn invariant features across the source domains, and then by doing that, the network is not biased towards one domain, and then you get better accuracy in a test domain. Yeah. So yeah, so when I say unsupervised, so this thing, unsupervised basically means that your image, you still know if it is coming from domain 1 through n, but you don't know whether it's a cat image or a dog image, right? Yeah, so on those images, you don't compute the loss. Sorry. You're just computing the loss on the only on the D. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. And then with supervision is basically you have labels for even the test domain, but for the source domains, in that case, you have hundreds and thousands of examples, and you just have 100 examples in this case. So, but yeah, this was from 2015. Field has gone crazy after like 8 years. So, like, but I feel like this is the main paper where it all started in deep learning. So, worth mentioning the basic idea of how. Yeah. Then the other key paper which came around in 2017 was this thing called MAML, M-A-M-L, meta learning or learning to learn. So this is again, this was like, I don't know if it's still a hot field. If you search meta learning, you'll get hundreds of thousands of papers. And this was the main key paper which talked about how to, as the title suggests, model agnostic meta learning. You're making your model agnostic to different domains, right? Let me first motivate the task, and then we'll come back to the algorithm. But again, I will only briefly mention the algorithm in passing, so it's worth reading the paper in full detail. So one more thing I should mention here is that it's all about learning good features in deep learning, right? So as you go through all these slides, just think about why any change that we make in the network is helping it to learn features for the task that we are interested in. So for example, we saw that just by negative lambda, we are able to achieve invariant features, right? So the goal of meta learning in general is to learn implicit priors from different domains uh, to again make sure that we are learning invariant features in the network. So first I'll motivate the examples of where it can be used. So imagine you're given a task of segmenting these vertebrae in CT, right? So these are CT images of the entire human spinal column, going from cervical vertebrae all the way till the hip. So it's a set of 32, I think, vertebrae, or 36, 32, I don't know. And then if you know anything about human spinal column, is that all the vertebrae look very different. The upper vertebrae from the lower vertebrae, they have huge like varying structure, right? So on the left, you can see some images or crops of the vertebrae in upper part of the body, and on the right you can see some of the vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, which are fractured, right? So these are healthy, right? They have good spacing between them. The spinal disc is nice. You can see all the bones are healthy. Over here, you will see that you can see the fractures in between over here. There is spinal discs which are slipped, or you can again see that this bone is broken, right? And then again, on at the last, here you can see that not only the images are of low resolution over here, right, like noisy images, you also see that these are severely fractured bones over here. And then there are images which have these punctures over here, right? These are screws which are placed for the surgery, right? So you want to make sure your model is able to generalize or able to handle all these different cases, right? And as you can imagine, like it's a tough task to make sure that model is able to segment all these different settings, right? So I talked about domain adaptation, right? Where during training time, you have source domains, and then you have either labeled few examples of training domain, or you have unlabeled examples of training domain, right? So how is it different from domain generalization? So domain adaptation, you have a lot of source domains, but a few examples of target domain is available as well at training. In domain generalization, you have source domains, but you have zero information about your target domain, right? Be it labeled and labeled, you just don't have anything. So it is like more realistic setting of generalizing to other domains, right? So for example, so I'll try to tell you how we develop three different kinds of experiments. So first is generalization across the vertebral anatomy, the intensity profile, and the intervertebral discs, right? So as I said that these images are very heterogeneous, and the intensity profile varies a lot across your entire spinal column, even in a single person, right? And the disc spacing is very different from all the vertebrae. And of course, the anatomy is again very different from thoracic versus lumbar versus cervical vertebrae. So a single model, even if it's coming, images are coming from the same human being, it's not guaranteed that it will do good for all the vertebrae. So that's what we want to generalize first to, that a model is able to generalize across these particular settings, right? Then the other kind of generalization we can do is that you have the training set of source domains, which consists a lot of healthy vertebrae or vertebrae coming from healthy subjects. But you want at test time, you are given subjects which are coming from dislocated vertebrae images, right? Or which have fractures. So a model is being trained of healthy, and you want to generalize it to images coming from fractured vertebrae. Right? So again, at training time, you're only given healthy. You have no information about fractures, but you want your model to actually generalize it too. And then the third kind of experiment we can do is like putting everything together, unseen anatomies, right? From images coming from different protocols, having a lot of different kinds of fractures and pathology, and images just having a weird anatomy or arbitrary orientations and field of views in your images. So it's like generalizing to everything out there in the real world. So these are the ways that you can use domain generalization in medical imaging, right? So think of the ways that you can do in your own projects, right? So how do we actually go about doing this? Right? I'll try to explain it, but if you don't get it in one go, it's fine. Right? But just wanted to give you some intuition about, like, this is a very simplified version of what I'm gonna say. So imagine, again, you have 3 domains, right, in your training time. So this box, you have these domain 1, domain 2, domain 3. These 3 domains basically represents some portion of the body, like some portion of the vertebral column. And as I said, they have different anatomies. So we are trying to generalize across anatomies over here. And then at test time, you are given, let's say, the hip or the cervical portion or some other portion that you haven't seen in, during training, right? So these things you are seeing during training, and this is that you want to generalize to. And the idea is we are going to use the concept of meta-learning to be able to do domain generalization on this, right? And the final goal is to be able to make a network which is able to reduce this covariate shift between this data distribution shift between these 2 source domain and target domains, right? So what is the idea of meta learning? So it's kind of like making the network learn implicit priors so that it is able to generalize to different modalities or different kind of settings, right? So we have our source domains, right? Input source domains. Now let's go through this step by step. MLDG is basically meta learning for domain generalization, right? So input at training time, we have these 3 source domains, right? Called S. We have our model with parameters theta and some hyperparameters alpha, beta, gamma, right? And we do the following procedure for n number of iterations, right? And your networks can be any segmentation network, let's say unit, right? So at every iteration of training, like you go into your PyTorch code, and you do for I equals 1 through n, the following steps. So at every step, you have the source domains. You split that into randomly 2 images or 2 domains into something called meta train, represented by S cap, and meta test, represented by S bar, right? Just this meta test is not this test domain, right? This is meta test is just one of these images, just to be sure that you're not confused. So divide or like split source domains into 2 categories, meta train and meta test. So let's say these 2 go into my meta train and one of those go into my meta test, right? That's it. Now what you do is you have 2 steps when you use the meta train data, and the other time you do the meta test data. So after dividing or like splitting them into 2 domains, meta train and meta test, you do a forward pass with your meta train images, right? You do a forward pass through the network, and then you compute the gradients by doing a single pass of backpropagation, right? So you get some kind of update of your loss function with respect to your model parameters theta, right? Simple, you're just going through it once, right? And then you just update your parameters of the network. Theta prime is theta minus alpha, the gradient, right? This is just SGD, right? So you have just 1 forward and 1 backward pass, that's it, with just 2 of the source domains meta train images, right? Next, what you do is with that meta test image, right? You do another forward pass, right? and you get another set of updated parameters, theta prime, right? So you do one forward pass with your meta train, get the updated gradients. Then you do another forward pass with your meta test images. And then now you have like two different kind of gradients, one coming from meta test and one coming from meta train. You just basically have some weighting of these two gradients, and then you just basically use another SGD to update the final model parameters, right? So what we did in this particular step is that to get the final model parameters, we first started with the meta train step to get some parameters. And then using this prior knowledge from the meta train step, now we are updating the meta test step, right? So using source domain 1 and 2, I am updating the network for source domain 3, right? So now think of it how it is like transfer learning. So to train the meta test step, I'm actually using some information from the already forward pass using the meta training images, right? Does it make sense? It's basically like transfer learning going on here. I'm updating my model parameters, right? And then using those updated parameters, I use that as a prior for the remaining of my source domains, right? And then using that, I get some kind of final model parameters for that particular iteration. Then I do this again in the next iteration. And this time, since it's a random split, my three domains can interchange between meta train and meta test. So now these two can become meta train, and this could be my meta test, right? And then you keep on switching that. So everything is getting jumbled upon, and then there is some kind of priors going on between different domains. And then the hope here is, well, they show it in the paper mathematically, why this gives invariant features. Yeah. And then once you're done with all the iterations, you are kind of confident that these model parameters, weights, and biases, when you deploy it in your real world on this test domain, it does better than a simple vanilla unit. So yeah, it's more like, obviously I've skipped n number of steps here, how this computation is done. You compute second order derivatives, higher order derivatives like Hessian and stuff. But I hope you get an intuitive understanding of how transfer learning is happening and how priors are being built implicitly in the network just at the training time. Any questions? Yeah. 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 So like in one epoch, you see all your training data in different settings. Yeah. But yeah, the concept comes from this particular paper, the mammal paper, and then the next paper, MLDG, takes that idea and applies it to classification network. And then we did an empirical study of how this can be helpful in segmentations. It's kind of slow to train, obviously, than a vanilla network because it's computing the Hessian. And then we'll split this quite a few number of times, but yeah. Yeah, let's not spend too much time into this, but just wanted to give you an idea of how, and then once we have this, right? So we have a baseline model where you're just training your source. Baseline model could be, let's say, unit, right? You have your source domain, you're just putting data randomly into unit and you get your output. and then let's call that a baseline. And then the second way of training the network is what I just talked about, the MLDG framework, right? Where your architecture is still unit, but you're training in this particular setting, right? And just recall that we have no information in this about the actual test domain, right? And then after this, what you can do to further improve the accuracy is like do few shot learning on top of this, which basically, for our purposes in this course is like, once I have this MLDG model, I can just use it in a transfer learning setting where I freeze the weights of this MLDG model and take one or two examples from my test image and further boost the accuracy, right? So it's really helpful when you have a test domain for which you don't have a lot of labels, but you can improve the accuracy just by going and labeling one or two images and then try to do feature learning. So, for example, if you just see the top row, right, where the test domain is the lumbar region, we are trying to segment the lumbar area, and the three source domains that this particular model was trained on was the lower thoracic, upper, and the middle thoracic regions. And these are dice scores. So you can see that baseline model gives us like 81, and then we see a huge improvement and we get 87 with this MLDG model. And then with few shot learning, when we are just freezing the weights of MLDG and doing fine tuning with just one training example from the test set, we can get further improvement of like 1 to 1.5 dice scores. Right, and here you can see that this is the original image, this is the ground truth. With baseline, you see a lot of noise that is getting segmented in the background. With MLDG, you kind of correct a lot of noise, but you still have some noise. And then with few shot learning, you just get rid of most of the noise in the background incorrect segmentation. Yeah, and then so that was basically telling you about what domain adaptation is and what domain generalization is. And we saw one paper in domain adaptation, and we saw one paper using meta learning for domain generalization, right? So till now, what we have talked about in these 45 minutes is trying to build good representations and trying to build networks which are able to generalize to other settings, right? Just wanted to highlight that we have you can use meta learning in various different settings by bringing in shape priors as well. Then let's go. Yeah. Any questions? No. Okay. Let me think about. I'm just thinking whether to continue with domain disentanglement or do topology stuff. For both the things, I need 45 minutes. I think you can do topology stuff, right? Instead of this transformers. This way, like if you go see the slide, I was trying to talk about GANs a bit and then do image-to-image translation. I don't know if you want to talk about this during registration.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, you'll give me the harder stuff too. I'm just kidding. Okay, this is already in the slides, but if you are interested in how GANs and how image synthesis is used for segmentation image registration, you can see something called domain disentanglement, which I feel is pretty cool. And then, yeah, maybe I can cover this on Monday for 30 minutes. Feel like I can speak more about it than other topics. Okay. So shape, geometry, and topology. Okay, so remember from last time I showed you the ex vivo postmortem images of how we got nice segmentations using NN unit. And then I also showed you one image where we were able to segment using topology correction the deep sulci regions and correct the topology and make sure that the white matter surface looks like a sphere. It has a spherical topology, right? So we'll talk about that in detail today, but using deep learning instead of level sets and fast matching algorithms. Right? So I'm gonna throw a lot of concepts in the next few slides. Again, just remember the intuition behind these things. So we're gonna deal with geometry and topology, which are two different yet related concepts. So geometry, these are Wikipedia definitions. So geometry is anything which is related to the property of the space in which your shape lives. So it could be the distance between different shapes, the size of the shape, or relative position of the different shapes, right? So that's geometry. Topology is basically the properties of the shape. So geometry is about the space, and topology is intrinsic to the shape, right? So topology is basically, think of it as some kind of geometric property of a geometric object, which gets preserved when you do some kind of deformation on a shape, right? So if I'm trying to stretch a particular 3D object, or I'm trying to twist it, crumble it, or any kind of deformation, so what goes through that process, you can think of it as topology. So over here, you can see that by having different kinds of deformations, we are able to deform this cup through a series of transformations into this donut, right? So geometry would be something where this shapes live in the 3D space. Anything you do to the space is called geometry. Anything you do to this shape intrinsically is called topology, right? These are very, very dumbed down definitions, so don't quote me on that. Uh, uh, read a book, ask Paul on this. But just for our understanding, think of this cup which has like this one handle, right? And but it has just one hole, right? So we say that this particular cup is topologically equivalent to this donut when you can continuously deform it without tearing it apart into this donut, and you still have that same properties. So these things are topologically same, right? That is what we call like topological property, which is invariant under deformation. So here it had one hole and it still has one hole, or like cavity, and so these things are same. Similar, not same. Okay, so where do they appear in, and why do we care about this in medical imaging, right? So as I showed you the other way in the postmortem images, is that, but now I'm showing it in vivo image over here. So we have a T1 weighted image. The green over here is the white matter surface. Sorry. Right. So the green here is the white matter surface. The red here is the PL surface, right? So let's just zoom here, and over here we can see that there is something called partial volume effects, which you might have already. Have you seen? Has Paul talked about partial volume effects? No. Okay. So imagine you have a voxel, right? And if you really zoom into your picture, you can see that a voxel sometimes might have actually two structures going through it, right? It might be at the intersection of a gray matter, white matter boundary, And that way it has information from both the structures, right? So that particular voxel is not fully into either gray matter or white matter, it is partially into one of these structures, right? And because of that, you can have inconsistency in your segmentation. And generally, partial volume effects lead to these geometry instability and geometric topology unstable segmentations. So if you zoom over here, and you really zoom over here, so you can see that these 3D segmentation over here, you have these cavities over here, this particular hole here, and this particular large hole over here, right? To the naked eye, it looks fine, right? But geometrically and topologically, these are incorrect segmentations, right? And if you want to do some downstream processing on it, like compute curvature, thickness estimates, these are, you need to correct for them before you can compute any sort of information from it, right? So either you can like cut this and fix the topology. So this is like a hole, or you can fill it, right? Either you can cut it or you can fill it. And what in medical imaging, especially with a white matter surface, what we want is that this particular structure to have the same topology of a sphere, right? That is generally what we are aiming for. That if you deform this white matter surface continuously without tearing it apart or without introducing cuts into it, you are able to map it into a sphere, right? So that is the aim that we are looking for. So we don't want cavities, handles, holes, or disconnected components. By disconnected component, I mean you have a large white matter surface here, but you generally have, or you could have a few spurious voxels lying around here. And again, we don't want that, right? So these are the things that you want to do. These are generally done after your whole segmentation algorithm. So you do it as a post-processing step, right? Or you can also try to come up with smart ways to incorporate this topology correction step within the deep learning network itself. Right? Okay. The other thing is something, how do we know one thing is topologically equivalent to other structure? So we can define some kind of invariant mathematical attributes, such as Euler characteristic, and we can get a number from, let's say, the correction of white matter surface. We can compute its Euler characteristic, and we can compute the Euler characteristic of a sphere. And if those things are same, we can say that these things are topologically equivalent, right? So what is Euler characteristic? It is nothing but if you convert your segmentation into a 3D triangulated mesh, so you can compute the number of vertices, the number of edges, and the number of faces, right? And if you compute this particular formula, V minus E plus F, you get something called an Euler number, right? Or Euler characteristic. And we know that for a sphere, it's 2. So we want to make sure our segmentation also has a Euler characteristic of 2, right? This is what we want. So take an example of this particular tetrahedron, right? It has 4 vertices, 1, 2, 3, and 1 is behind, right? There are 4 vertices. There are 6 edges. So 1, 2, there is like third one going on. Like, so there are 3 edges on the ground, and then there are 3 edges going here, right? So there are 6 edges, and there are 4 faces, 1 on the ground, and 2 you can see, and 1 from behind, right? So 4 vertices, 6 edges, and 4 faces. If you do V minus E plus F, we get 2, right? So this is the Euler characteristic for this particular tetrahedron, right? And then we can compute Euler characteristics for a lot of different shapes. So for the matter surface that I showed, after going through some kind of topology correction, if it has the same Euler characteristic as a sphere, then I can say that we did a good job in correcting for all the topological errors, right? And our segmentation is smooth and nice. So that's a very basic intuition of what we are trying to achieve here, right? One more thing is, so as I showed you in the last class as well, and also here, that once you get these volumetric segmentations, you convert them into meshes, which have vertices, edges, and faces, right? And each of these things can be thought of as building blocks, right? And then you build your whole mesh out of it. So like vertices, edges, this small triangle, this tetrahedron, right? So you have this system of building blocks which you can use to build your entire 3D mesh. In geometry processing field, we just call them simplicial complex or simplices. Like these are types of different simplices. That's what we want to know for this lecture. Right? So I talked about why we want topology correction. I talked about how can we check for topology correction by understanding its Euler characteristic. And then I briefly talked about these building blocks that you can think of to make meshes. And the last thing before we need to understand a topology correction algorithm is something called Betti numbers, right? So again, this is something I already talked about. We are just giving some kind of fancy name to different kinds of properties of a topological structure. So the number of connected components in an object, we can just call it, let's say, Betti number. Whoever Betti was, after that, there's Betti number B naught, right? The number of circular holes in let's say, in this particular surface, if we count all the number of holes, we would just call it's beta 1 or Betti number 2, right? And then we can count the number of cavities on our segmentation, and we will just call it Betti number beta naught, beta 2, right? We're just giving it names for different kind of simplicial complexes, right? Or different kinds of these structures. So this slide is very important for the next 30 minutes, right? So Betti numbers are nothing but giving these names for these different kinds of components which build up our segmentation or our object. Right? All we need to know is connected component, which is, you already know what a connected component is. You can have multiple connected components in an image, and we want to make sure that we have the right number of connected components. Circular holes and cavities, we want to get rid of these things in our segmentations, right? Right. So thinking about how these things, you can use these things to make sure your segmentation is correct. So I just wanted to highlight, before going into the deep learning method, that you have already studied in the segmentation lecture about level sets, right? Yeah, right? No? Active contours. Yeah, okay. So active contours, you already know, we have these surfaces in 3D or curves in 2D, and you deform that in the space to be able to segment your structures, right? They are done in two different ways. One is called level sets, and the other is called fast matching methods. So as Paul already talked about, that they are based on differential equations, specifically PDEs, right? Level sets are class of active contour, or like numerical methods, which are based on solving an initial value problem of a PDE. And fast matching is another set of numerical algorithms, but they are solved using a boundary value problem, right? Just two different ways of computing a segmentation. So think of level sets as evolving based on a heat equation, and think of fast matching methods based on a wave equation. One is an initial value problem, one is a boundary value problem. Yeah. So what Paul talked about was like how you can compute the curvature and the region information, and then when the curve comes towards the boundary, the curvature, using the intensity gradients, it kind of stops there, and the curvature, when it is constant, it just flows with one particular term, stuff like that, right? So you have these different energy terms in your active contour formulation, right? And now nothing stops it with from giving it extra information about the object of interest, right? So we need some kind of prior, in particular, to make sure that our algorithm is able to generalize to a wide variety of images, right? So if I know that I want to segment a particular human body in my image, but my image is very noisy, so what I can do is I can give some kind of shape prior, or some kind of extra information in that energy term of your active contours, which tells the algorithm that, hey, there is a shape which looks like a human, and I want to segment that in my image, right? So think now you try to connect all the concepts that we have understood so far of how neural networks are, how the business of computer vision and image processing is coming up with good representations and building priors into our energy functions and networks. Right? So these are two papers which are key papers in segmentation methods based on active contours, level sets, and fast matching algorithms, where they have one more energy function which takes care of some kind of shape prior, right? So just to give you a concrete example from these papers. So suppose using active contours, I want to segment this particular hand, right? In this particular image, right? And you know that it's a pretty tough problem because you have a lot of occlusion in the background, and you have this occlusion right in the object as well, right? And how my algorithm is supposed to know where just by making deforming the curve with just region information and intensity information and curvature information, it won't do a good job, right? Because it has no idea of what these occlusions are. Because if you start with some kind of active contour over here, it might compute the gradient of this particular mouse, and it will just stop over here, right? If the curve is coming from here. So what can I do is I can have a rough estimation of placing some kind of prior of a hand and give that information to that energy function so that it knows that it is segmenting some kind of hand, right? So if you just follow the cursor, in this particular top row, we are using active contour method without any shape prior. So from left to right, it's evolution of the different iterations. So you start with a curve like this, and then you kind of iterate it, and you see that it fails, right? But on the bottom row, you can see that you are now giving some kind of shape information. You're giving some kind of shape information, and as the evolution takes place, it is able to segment the surface correctly, or the curve correctly, even when there is so much occlusion going behind and on top of it. And again, the same idea holds over here. On the top row, it's without the shape prior, segmenting this human. As you go through the iterations, it kind of stops way before it, right? So it kind of sees that there are gradients over here, and then the energy function just assumes that that's where it has to stop, so it just stops over here, same with here. But if you put a shape prior into the energy function, then it is able to segment it much more properly. Right. So that was putting shape priors into context, and so now there are two things that I talked about: how to put shape information into your segmentation algorithm, and that you also need to put some kind of geometry and topology information, right, to make sure your segmentations are better. So again, for medical imaging, a couple of papers which take care of correcting for those topology of fixing those holes and cavities and handles in your 3D images or your 3D segmentations are these two key papers. If you want to know more about it, I think these are the main papers which correct for those missegmentations, again using surface-based level sets and fast matching algorithms. I will I just want to give a good understanding of why we are doing this. Right. So if you see these two videos, right, you can see that my task over here is to segment the different shapes and the different, can you see it? Yeah. The flower, right? And I'm using geodesic active contours and region-based methods over here. And we start with an outer curve and it hugs these two images using intensity gradients and using information of intensities in the foreground and the background. And also the third term is like your energy bending curves, like curvature information or Laplacian or something like that, right? So it works pretty good, right? So the idea over here is that if you start with a topologically correct curve and you let it evolve over time, you will get a topologically correct segmentation. Oops. The next idea here is that I'm trying to segment the vertebrae on the left, right? So I start with some initial seed points, if you can see. It starts with some points which I have located. And then again, it uses the same method and it tries to evolve over time to get a segmentation of the lumbar vertebrae and the hips, right? But you see over here that there are some inconsistency in the segmentation, right? If you see that there are some holes, cavities, and you don't get some good segmentations here. So using shape priors, shown here only for lumbar vertebrae 5, I can put some extra information in the energy term and make sure that my surface evolution is in such a way that I'm able to get these nice looking surfaces, which doesn't have any holes and cavities here. Right? So I'm putting some extra information about shapes and topology, which I know a priori from the world into my algorithm to get these nice segmentations. So is the motivation clear from all these slides? Right. So any questions so far? Okay, one last thing again. So just focus here. If these are some voxels in a segmentation, right? You can see that there is this hole here, which I want to fill, which I want to correct for. So there are two ways to correct it, depending upon the context and the anatomy of region, that you can either remove this hole by removing this particular voxel to get something like this, right? So that hole is gone, right? Or I can fill the remaining voxels here and behind so that, again, that particular hole is gone. So it's either removing it or filling it, right? So this is what these two papers try to do in 3D, and also all these papers. Again, these are all non-deep learning papers. Right? If someone wants to get into neuroimaging, these are the papers to go after. Okay, now we are ready to, 15 minutes is all I need, is how to think about enforcing topology and geometry constraints in a deep neural network using the concept of persistent homology and Betti numbers, right? Again, Betti numbers are those number of connected components, handles, and cavities, right? Persistent homology, you will see now. So again, this is some kind of cell that we are interested in segmenting into these different regions. And you want to make sure that the boundaries are well segmented, right? So image, the ground truth looks nice. But without topology correction, you basically get something like this, right? Where it's hard to segment these boundaries over here. This is again using a deep neural network. So this is, let's say, a simple unit, and this is a unit with this idea of correcting for the topology, right? So you can see that how much it has improved from here to here. And you can see where the algorithm is actually failing in a simple unit. It's like these hard to recognize boundaries over here, where it doesn't have an idea whether this part is background or foreground because there are cells at this particular boundary. Just like how we saw on that hand, there was occlusion, right? So this is where it helps. And this is, yeah, the final output after correcting for topology. So how do they do it? Okay, so just some setup. Okay, so we will use the idea of Betti numbers and persistent homology. Persistent homology is a very abstract concept in pure math. I don't know much about it, but we'll try to see how it is applied in medical imaging. So the problem setup is something like here. You have an input image, your CNN. This could be your favorite architecture that you want. And then you know that once you have a CNN, the last layers are basically a softmax layer, which gives you some likelihood function f, right? A probability map, which you generally threshold at some particular value to give your final output segmentation, right? And you have a ground truth image G, right? From a training set. And every step, what you do is basically you compute some kind of loss function, which is binary cross entropy or dice loss, right? This is what you do. Now, all I'm saying is let's just also add some other kind of loss function. Let's call it L topo, which stands for a topology loss function, right? Which takes care of all these missegmentations, right? So how do we design this particular loss functions using persistent homology? The other thing is with this loss function is that you want to make sure that this loss function is differentiable, right? So you can have a nice loss function, but if the loss function is not differentiable, that means that you can't backpropagate through it, and it is not helping you in learning, right? So whenever you come up with a new loss function in your own research, it's important to write down it step by step and make sure that it's actually, you can compute gradients of that with respect to your network parameters, right? So, yeah. Now it's a bit hairy to explain this in like 10 minutes, but I'll try my best. Okay, so let's see these two functions here, x and g, right? These are just two different segmentations of some structure. So these are the structures we are going to work with in this part. This particular structure is the ground truth structure. Let's call it the ground truth, where you have this whole one connected component, right? Remember the numbers, that it has one connected components and it has two holes, right? And it has two handles, 1 and 2, right? And this guy, which let's say we get from our current segmentation method, we have two connected components, right? We have just one handle and we just have one hole, right? And we want the segmentation to be corrected so that it looks like this, right? Because this is the actual segmentation that we're interested in. So what I'm trying to say here is that I want to make sure that the number of Betti numbers for connected components, for handles, and for holes is the same as the ground truth, right? So I want to go from two connected components to one connected component. I want to go from one holes to two holes and one handle to two handles, right? So these are the things that we'll be working with. How can we leverage intrinsic topology characteristics to make sure our network is learning these properties of the segmentation, right? Does it make sense what we are going after? Right? So, and recall that I told you that the ground truth is G, right? This guy. And the likelihood function, which is your softmax output, is F, right? This guy. Right? And one more thing that you already know is that you can threshold your likelihood function at different probabilities to get different segmentations, right? You can threshold at 0.5, or have a more conservative threshold at 0.8, 0.9, right? This is something that you already are very familiar with, right? So we'll leverage these properties and try to come up with a loss function, right? So look at this particular figure, right? And you already know what the ground truth looks like. The ground truth is this, right? So, and I'm gonna vary my alpha from, alpha is some constant. I'm gonna vary it from 1 to 0, from left to right, okay? So, and remember the likelihood function was f. At different thresholds, you'll get different segmentation. And that is what I'm trying to do. Going from left to right, I am taking my likelihood function f and thresholding it at different probability values, right? So at alpha 0.95, I get this particular structure, right? So if I threshold my likelihood function f at 0.95, I get something like this. If I threshold a probability of 0.8 or alpha of 0.8, I get something like this, right? And 0.5, right? And so on till 0.05. Right? All I'm doing is taking my likelihood function f and thresholding at different values of probabilities or alpha, right? That's it. And this process of thresholding at different alpha values is called filtration, right? We are filtering for different values of alpha and p, right? So can someone tell me what is happening as I'm varying these different alphas? What do you notice in these structures? Like, what do you notice in the predictions, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right. So we are going from 2 connected components all the way to this 1 connected component, right? We are going from, and we are also doing one more thing. We are introducing and killing things, right? So we are killing 2 components over here into 1, right? And we are basically also introducing new things into our segmentations. There were no handles over here or no holes over here. But now we have successfully introduced 1 handle over here. And then as we keep on going, we are introducing 2 handles and 2 holes, right? So it's all about birth and death of these Betty numbers or these quantities, right? And we want to track them, right? So over here, blue indicates your connected components, let's say, and this maroon or red or burgundy, it indicates your handles, right? So I'm just keeping track as I'm going from alpha 0.95, alpha 1 to alpha 0. I'm just keeping track of how many holes and how many connected components have I introduced or have I killed, right? And I keep track of the time, like time is just a number here, but when it is happening in this process, at what alpha value it is happening, right? So at alpha 1, so there is always one connected component for sure, right? And then I have one connected component I started with here, but then that connected component died over here because here I now have, sorry, I'm saying it again. I have 2 connected components here, and then over here, 2 connected components have died, and now it's just 1 connected component, right? So there was a birth of 2 connected components and now death of this. Here, I introduced a hole, right? And it died over here. There are no more holes. Here, I introduced another hole, right? And then it died over here, right? That's it. So I am keeping track of birth and death times of these connected components and holes, aka these Betty numbers, beta naught, beta 1, beta 2, right? And then I can make a graph of this likelihood function. Let's say this particular graph, the death time and the birth time of this for each of these things, right? I can make a graph of this or like quantify it in some way. And again, I can do the same thing for the ground truth function as well. right? Because what is happening in ground truth is that this is the graph for the ground truth, where I always have this connected component. It never dies. Once it takes birth, it is always like that. And then the two holes or the handles, they're again, they remain constant, right? So what I want to do, I just want to take some kind of loss function between these two graphs, right? So essentially, I'm keeping track of these connected components and handles and holes via Betty numbers, and doing it in a nice way, in a continuous way from alpha 1 to alpha 0 at different thresholds of the probability function, so that I cover all the range of different possibilities, right? Yeah, so there is in the paper, there are ways to compute this loss function, and then you basically plug that along with your dice laws and do training on that, and the hope is that you get corrected topology for your segmentation. And these kind of diagrams are called persistence diagrams. Yeah, so you basically just take mean square error of for every structure, you take the birth time minus the birth time of the predictions and the ground truth, right? So just some quantitative examples. Every row represents a different example. Here are the images. These are the ground truth, and these are from other methods, these three columns, and the last column is from the topology correction. So if you just focus on these, let's say this particular retina image, you can see that the other methods which don't apply this have a lot of missegmentations, and then this greatly improves and looks like the ground truth. Yeah, and then there are other ways of thinking about connectivity and topology using some other paper. These are based on skeletons. Again, I've just put this in the slide so that you can see it offline, just to give you another idea of how using your simple erosion and dilation concepts from image processing, you can build simple networks to correct for topology. Yeah, I think I should stop here. So just to recap, we looked at a lot of different things today: representation learning, self-supervision learning, for all of that for transfer learning. Then we looked at domain adaptation, domain generalization, to make sure your models can perform well on test time. And then we looked at how you can put geometry and shape priors into deep neural networks. We covered a lot. But the idea here is that now you can go and see all these papers and whatever you like to explore more in depth. Yeah.